And then now let's introduce, let's see here. So now we have Jochem Gerritsen. I hope
Jochem Gerritsen.
Okay, I was very close almost. He is the director of Infloat in the Netherlands, and it's a lending blockchain consultancy firm, and they focus on security tokens. And he's also the writer of a very acclaimed securitytoken.it newsletter. So this should be very interesting. I will not drag it out.
Great.
Welcome yourself.
So I'll do this with my keyboard because it works. Great. I won't do this in Danish because my Danish is not very good. So I hope that fits with everyone. So today I'll talk about the fundamentals of security tokens and security token design. If you have any questions, in the meantime, I was kind of banking on the fact that people know what it is, but if you have questions halfway through or whatever, then please let me know. So this is me. I work for a very small company called Infloat in the Netherlands. I might look a bit tired because I flew here at 7 a.m. this morning, so woke up very early. And basically what we do, one of our goals is to help blockchain technology and tokenized securities gain adoption. And we do that by workshops, also for students, for instance. We've worked with a couple of Dutch universities, but also business consulting for instance, companies that want to issue a tokenized security. Aside from that, so here is a big map of some companies we work with or have worked with. And we also do research. So we find it quite important that this education is out there, that we can educate people on the use of blockchain and the use of tokenized assets. And so we issue, let's say, quarterly reports on different topics. So here was an introduction to blockchain-based tokens. We recently also published a report on tokenizing SME equity. And I have a couple here, so if you're interested in that, then please come by and grab one afterwards. We also write, I also write a weekly newsletter, which you can find online. You can also sign up. People generally quite like it, so every time I'm speaking at a conference, I of course hope more people will sign up to our newsletter. Basically what we do is to try to cover the news on tokenized assets, so it's not industry broad for any blockchain news, but more specifically on tokenized securities, tokenized assets, and send it out on a weekly basis. So you can subscribe here. I go to this link. I'll show it again later. So let me tell you a story. Of course, we know a lot about this ICO hype. So in 2017, it kind of started. A lot of money started flowing into ERC20 tokens, Ethereum-based tokens, and that got quite significant actually. This was 2017, then 2018 kind of dropped down again. It's not exactly the same scale, but more or less. So I think it's quite a fascinating industry. A lot of people say it was this ICO Wild West where a lot of people could just create financial products or create kind of things to invest in out of thin air with no actual basis. And if I take a look at it, one of the questions I would ask is are these people that invested this massive amount of money, even though for them it might have been small, but in such scale, it was so much money, are these people still looking for an alternative to invest in? Or is that something that they kind of touched their hands on and now it's not so interesting anymore because maybe they lost a lot of money? And if we take a look at Google, for instance, then you see a lot of these kind of hype-ish articles about ICOs versus STOs. So I'm assuming here people know what an ICO is. If that's not the case, then please let me know. So initial coin offering versus a security token offering. And you see that this kind of framing is happening globally, where a lot of people say, okay, the ICO that was passed, and now everyone that's invested in security token offerings because it's kind of the legit way of issuing a new token. And let's do that. But I think what my point is, specifically of this presentation, so also if you want to remember one thing, then remember this, is that we should look less at these kind of ICOs as a model for security tokens or tokenized securities, and look more at securities as a model for tokenized security. And so I would also want to say, so my topic was the fundamentals of security tokens and security token design, but I don't like the word security token that much, so I think we should more talk about tokenized securities. And with securities, of course, we mean equity or debt or derivatives, and these are now transacted on the blockchain or DLT or decentralized ledger technology. And so if we look at kind of these fundamentals of tokenized securities and say, okay, we shouldn't look at ICOs, but instead we should look at how securities are right now. Of course, there's a lot of people from kind of the financial industry here today, I think. And so you're perhaps much more familiar with it than I am. But we should look at traditional securities and see, okay, we can divide that into debt, equity, and derivatives, for instance. But it also depends very much on local regulation. So securities can be, we often talk about securities as being this one thing, but securities in the EU are quite different from the US, are quite different from Hong Kong. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind for both for securities, of course, but also for tokenized securities. Because it's really this hype that, and a lot of people talk about it in the same way, but it's not necessarily the same thing, and very much depends on the jurisdiction you're in. I think later today we also have a talk from a lawyer from Liechtenstein, and you see that laws in Liechtenstein, for instance, or in Luxembourg are very different, and are also recently adopted to allow tokenized securities the same status as securities have in those specific jurisdictions. So it really depends on the jurisdiction we're in. And then if we go back to these initial coin offerings, there's so many differences. Here's just a few that, for example, if you want to value security versus valuing a token issued in an initial coin offering, this was kind of this vague estimate where you would just think about how many users will I have in a year from now, what will the value they will transact on my platform be worth, and then let's say it's 10 cents now for when the token gets issued. And of course, the valuation of a security, and therefore also a tokenized security, is very different. And that's the same with marketing. We have a very different target group. Also the same with issuance. How are you going to issue that tokenized security is very different than how initial coin offerings are issued. And I think we should also think about it that way. So if we go to the fundamentals of tokenized securities, I say again, we should look first at the characteristics of securities. And look at if you want to create, or let's say you want to issue equity, then there's a certain level of risk involved for the person buying your equity. There's a certain value. There's a lot of different things that apply to the characteristics of a security that, of course, also apply to the characteristics of a tokenized security. But what we have to see is that there's this kind of this extra moon shape here that covers the characteristics of a tokenized security. And it's this that is really fundamental to the fundamentals of tokenized securities. It's we have all these aspects of a security plus the kind of the DLT or blockchain aspect that we have to take a look at. And we can think of course, of the many benefits of tokenized securities that are currently in place, or at least that are theoretically in place, because not so many tokenized securities have been issued yet. A lot of people talk about liquidity, for instance, and making illiquid assets liquid by tokenizing them, like real estate. A lot of other examples, for example, music license rights, things like that. It's not always the case. I think there's a lot of promise there that hasn't really materialized yet. So liquidity, for instance, there's, I know the CEO of BlockTrade is walking around here, who is trying to create a secondary market for tokenized securities in the EU. But there isn't any yet, as far as I know. In the US, there's maybe 2 or 3, but they also only have like 5 securities trading on there. But still, it's interesting to look at these at least alleged or promised benefits of tokenized securities, and that's really what the moon shape is here is all about. So it's liquidity, but also fractionalization. For instance, it's much easier to divide up a security into different fractions using blockchain technology. And of course, it brings also a negative impact. So not only benefits, but also downsides. I think it's not only that if you have a security, that a tokenized security is always better. So legal recognition, of course, is a major issue now here in Denmark. I'm not entirely sure to what extent that is an issue. But in the EU generally, to what extent can we recognize a tokenized security as a security? And retrievability may well be an issue. So if we have a tokenized security that is transacted on an Ethereum blockchain, for instance, and suddenly you make a mistake, and let's say it's a piece of a company that you own, and you make a mistake and you send it to the wrong person, do you still own the piece of the company? And hard forks, so when a blockchain kind of splits in two, what does that mean for your equity in this case, or for maybe you're expecting a payment of a tokenized debt that you're getting all the time, and suddenly there's now 2 tokens that represent that debt. So which one is then the real one, which really represents your security? And of course, user experience can also be a big issue. So there's a lot of companies, for instance, there's a company in the Netherlands who's building technology based on Ethereum that is helping funds to tokenize themselves. And they really do it from a very frictionless kind of point of view, so that the user doesn't really notice that they're using blockchain technology. However, if you want to give people real ownership of assets, then you should also educate them about how a wallet works, how we can hold that security. And that's in my experience and opinion, it's really still an issue of user experience, because until now, I'm very happy if you guys know any company that has a super user experience friendly wallet, for instance, but it's not really the case yet. And so if we go from the fundamentals to designing a tokenized security, we can talk about what do we mean by design. And of course, when you're issuing a security as a company, if you're issuing debt, or as a bank, there's a lot of different facets that come into play. So we have to conceptualize what is the security going to do, who's it for, and again, what benefits of tokenization of blockchain are we leveraging, and how does this play into the purpose, the strategy, and many other aspects. The target group also, of course, risk, trade life cycle, and more and more. So it's really the question of how can we design a security while taking into account the aspect of tokenization. And that's kind of what I'm trying to stress here, is that we should look at securities and the added benefit of blockchain, and kind of how that plays into when we're designing and creating a new security. So as I said, we have to look to this part, and there's a lot of different facets that we can look at, but a few are kind of this great stock picture, but a few are most prevalent, I would say. So first, of course, it's a security that's based on blockchain or decentralized ledger. And so what blockchain will we use? And if we take a look at hard forks, for instance, or also with Ethereum, there has been quite a scalability issue, especially when the CryptoKitties came along. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but these CryptoKitties were these digital representations of cats that people really liked and that people traded like a lot, and even so much that the whole blockchain, the whole Ethereum blockchain, got kind of stuck, let's say. So the amount of transactions per second was very, very low, simply because too many people were trading cats on the blockchain. It's still a funny story, but it's also definitely an issue, because if you have a security that needs to be traded on a secondary market, and suddenly you can't make the trade because some guy in the room is trading cats on the same blockchain, then that's something that we should avoid, of course. So we should take a look at what blockchain will use, what technology should we use, and do we expect the security to be traded at all, and much, and that also relates to that first question. Then we also should take a look at what rights should token holders or security token holders, tokenized security holders, have in this case. So do they receive regular payment, for instance? Is it a debt? Should they receive a coupon? And if so, in what currency should they receive this coupon in? So earlier today there was a talk here by a guy from MakerDAO, and they have built a stable coin, which can in which one of their coin equals $1. And the great thing of that is that we can now use these kind of technologies to pay coupons, for instance, or to pay back the debt that a company owes after issuing tokenized debt. But of course, this makes it also a bit more difficult in terms of user experience, etc. And should we also offer voting rights, for instance? And that is definitely possible, but we should take a look at all these different questions and then decide on what kind of technology we use. And if we look at companies like DigiShares today, there's a number of companies in the EU and in the US that have built their tokenization platform, their platform for issuing tokenized securities on a specific blockchain. So should you look for issuing your own tokenized security and look for the kind of different companies to work with, and that's definitely something to keep in mind, because if you prefer not to work with Ethereum, then I think half of the tokenization platforms can already be cut from your list. On the other side is, of course, is the legal aspect, and that depends on your jurisdiction. And the question is really, to what extent are blockchain-based securities recognized as such within your jurisdiction? So do tokenized securities, blockchain-based securities, get exactly the same rights as normal securities get in the place that you're issuing your tokenized security? And that's, of course, that's a very important question, because if that's not the case, then you're not really issuing the same thing as you would normally when creating the security. In the Netherlands, for instance, also the report we wrote was on the tokenization of SME equity. And in the Netherlands, it's a case that if, I'm not sure how it is in Denmark, in the Netherlands it's a case that if you want to transact equity, so a share from one person to another of a specific company, then it always has to go by the notary. And the notary has to give a stamp or write his approval or her approval, and basically say, okay, this share can be transacted from one person to the next. And so what we found is that we need to kind of go around this, because if we want shares to be transacted on a secondary market in the Netherlands, then of course we don't want a notary sitting somewhere with stamping all day every time a security that equity, that share changes hands. And so what we thought of was a kind of a different corporate structure, in which you have a standard LLC-like company that puts 100% of its shares in a foundation, and the foundation issues certificates for these shares, and these certificates can then be tokenized and also can be freely transacted and freely exchanged on secondary markets. And so there's a lot of different regulations that come into play, and that we have to take a look at when doing it. So if we want to design a tokenized security if we want to design any security, then there's a lot of different aspects that we have to take a look at. So of course I mentioned a few of them already. We also have to think about what kind of partnerships are we running with, for example, secondary markets, on the operations, what legal requirements do we have, how should it be developed in terms of the technical point of view, etc. And it's really the question of your specific product, financial product from security, and tokenized financial product, as to what extent you have to take a more extensive look at these aspects. So we can say, okay, perhaps marketing is very important in this case, because people don't really know what tokenized securities are. We have to educate them first before we can actually sell them the product. On the other hand, you can also say, such as with the tokenized equity in the Netherlands, maybe the legal requirements are super important to really get that covered. And so there's, I think, for every kind of aspect of a security, there's something to say for that. You have to take a look at it, but it really depends on the kind of product you're issuing, the kind of target group. Are you selling it to kind of retail investors or institutional investors? Yeah, so it's still kind of a generic conclusion, I would say. But the point is that you have to really take a look at where do these benefits of your tokenized security, of tokenization, come into play, and how do I make sure that these aspects are then covered. And that's, of course, that's the case for a pre-launch, but also for a post-launch or post-issuance. How are we going to make sure that KYC, for example, is covered also on secondary markets? Because with kind of classical Ethereum tokens, these can be exchanged freely on secondary markets, but even on decentralized secondary markets. And that means that if you would issue a tokenized security as a kind of such a token, then people could just trade it peer-to-peer. But if you have legal requirements with regards to your KYC, so you need to know, in the US, for instance, you may need to know that every person holding that piece of equity or that piece of debt is an accredited investor, then that's of course something that you would not want to allow. And then it's of course also about monitoring and reviewing for hopefully a second issuance or a different product that you want to issue, and learn from the first. So that's that's basically the talk for today. So my point was really that we have to focus on securities and look at securities as a basis of how to design tokenized securities, and not so much to these ICOs. You can think also definitely has its benefits, but in the case of tokenized securities, that's not really the point. So if you want to reach me, you can do so on Twitter or email here, and sign up to our newsletter. And thank you so much.